Thrilled to share that somebody from SGS just signed up.
Sorry, what was that, Trevor?
I was just sharing that somebody from SGS just signed up.
Was it Lena Bush?
Yep.
Yeah. He's a salesperson.
Awesome.
Those salespeople.
So you haven't admitted anybody yet, right?
Other than you two, no, because no one
Okay.
else has jumped in.
Right.
Trevor, do you want me to load the first slide up while
Yeah,
we wait?
yeah, go ahead and do that.
Okay, all right.
My audio okay, Trevor?
Great, great.
Good. Yeah, it comes out. Yep, looks good.
Great. Let me just make sure they flick through. Yeah.
Give it about another minute and 15 seconds. Keep admitting more of our audience participants. You got out of full screen on that, Rob.
Oh, okay. Hang on. Let me just.
Beautiful. Well, we'll go ahead and kick off, and there will be more people coming in to join us. Thank you all for joining us, those that are present, and to our both of the presenters, Victor and Robert. I'm just going to do a brief introduction for both Robert and Victor, and then I'll pass the floor to Robert and Victor to run through the slides. But Victor, founder of Risk Optimization Resource Center, 30 plus years of global experience, product safety, training, audit design, and program management, but not just human food, but animal feed as well. Powerful, practices there. And this is also going into cannabis as well as logistics. And it's phenomenal. One of the quotes that Victor shared with us early in course interactions: education never ends, Watson. It is a series of lessons with the greatest for the last. And that, Sherlock Holmes, from the author of Sherlock Holmes. So I thought that was just so beautiful to kick us off, because it's something that we're all practicing. Humbly, we're always students. Once students, always students. And to introduce Robert. Robert's a founder of Scientific Solutions and principal. 45 years of atomic and mass spectroscopy, including 25 years for manufacturer of atomic petroscopic instrumentation, and dedication to ACS. I mean, he's actually wearing his ACS shirt today, and his dedication to ACS, the American Chemical Society, as well as 100 other technical publications. I actually have recently picked up one of Robert's publications. And just a few notes of who I am and why I'm here. Founder and principal of Control Point product safety firm. My journey originally started in food, washing dishes, and then transitioned into food manufacturing, where food safety was my responsibility with not a whole lot of formal training, more so being put in the deep end and figuring it out as we go. But I do have a deep passion for it, especially now since my medical diagnosis of adult epilepsy, and I'm present for the long haul. So there's a lot of interest here, but I will pass it off to Victor now and we'll get to rolling. And by the way, just so everybody is aware, there's a little reactions button on your screen to raise your hand for Q&A. We've dedicated about 20 minutes for Q&A time. We're trying to stay out of the chat window, but if they do come through the chat window, I'll do my best to capture them and push them towards Victor or Robert, whoever will need to be answering them. But that's it for now. I'll pass the floor to you, Victor.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. My presentation, the section that I'm covering on the presentation, covers the risk optimization approach to a fast track initiative, which gives you tools and specific training to build a safer, more sustainable cannabis-based business. The next slide, please. So in order to move forward, we have to move backward and look backward and learn from the past. And one of the areas we can learn from is a legalized cannabis environment, such as the one in Canada right now, where they've been into this business for 5 years. They've been in a legalized environment, and they had several pitfalls that they've encountered, and we are going to focus on those and then move to how to avoid these. So cannabis producers and distributors, when they started off, had no competent guidance. And so businesses hired so-called consultants or experts from the food industry primarily, that brought food industry traditional design, no innovation to the cannabis sector, and as a result, designed poor systems that didn't function properly and were not efficient. There was tremendous waste of resources, money, time, etc. And to make things worse, they didn't incorporate proper cannabis-based market entry requirements for domestic markets as well as export markets, such as the European Union. As a result, they were non-compliant, and a lot of them did not get their cannabis licenses, or they did not get their approval to distribute product. The reason for this is because, again, because the systems weren't designed and customized for the cannabis sector, they were not prepared for the global markets and ended up having different consultants at different times tell them different things. This led to confusion and multiple versions of interpretation within the facilities, and it led to poor implementation of the system itself. Therefore, it didn't get approved by customers, didn't get approved by regulators, and they ended up losing customers or market share. Make things worse, initially, investors flocked to the cannabis sector thinking it's going to be a gold mine. They brought lots of money in, and a lot of the small, medium companies, instead of spending this money and looking for competent consultancy or competent advice and learning how to do it themselves, they adopted these consultant-driven systems, lost market share, and then investors got disenchanted and as a result started to drop off. So that made the small medium companies vulnerable to targets of undervalued takeovers. And that's what happened over the years. You have now industry that's consolidated and a few big players running the whole sector. And that left small medium companies out in the cold. So we want to avoid some of these pitfalls moving forward. Next slide, please. So what do you do What can you do to avoid the historical pitfalls? Well, the first thing is build an efficient, sustainable cannabis safety system that encourages and enhances business growth. To do this properly, you have to understand and control the cannabis quality system or safety system. Look for experienced cannabis-focused training and ready-to-use tools that you can use to fast-track your system, so to implement quickly, but at the same time, efficiently and comprehensively, so that you don't lose markets, you don't lose momentum, and most importantly, you don't lose investment. Streamline your system. In order to sustain the system, it has to be streamlined. And that's the problem that a lot of companies have encountered in the past. They didn't integrate their system, they didn't optimize their resources to include different market systems and requirements into their existing system. And as a result, they overcomplicated their manufacturing processes and ended up being non-compliant to a bunch of different areas instead of building something they really understood and something they could streamline. Next slide, please. So the key steps to building a sustainable cannabis business is research and identify real business and safety hazards in the cannabis and hemp sectors related to suppliers, transport and drivers, premises, pests, personnel and visitors, manufacturing controls, and markets. So all of these areas together will allow you to build an integrated system that will be designed to comply with most, if not all, market requirements, domestic as well as export. Risk assess these hazards to prioritize resources. Risk assessment is a very important component of hazard analysis to make sure you understand where your operational and business risks are, prioritize resources and tasks related to the controls over these risks, validate that the controls actually work to bring down the risk, and use the most updated tools and techniques to allow you to implement efficiently. Once you've established the control tasks, then you assign these to personnel and develop, again, innovative procedures and policies that encourage uptake of topics and uptake of concepts by individuals. Develop record forms and templates that are clear and easily demonstrable to both domestic and market customers or regulators. And use advanced training techniques. This is something we encourage within the risk optimization initiative to allow these quicker uptake and more integrated operational effectiveness. Next slide, please. So how can risk optimization, how can this initiative help you? Well, it'll help you design training and systems to maximize understanding, first of all. That is a very important component that a lot of people miss. They don't design components to be, or concepts to be understood by the people they're trying to train. They develop them thinking that the more volume they have or the more attractive it looks on paper, the more complex it seems, the more people will buy into it in terms of customer base, et cetera. What we found is the opposite. If you can demonstrate that you have translated these requirements in a way that people can update them better, you will actually be able to demonstrate to customers and to regulators that you're sustaining an effective system. Next, focus on risk reduction and increased market access. What are the techniques and tools that will get you into the market and keep you there, minimizing your risk of rejection, recall, market barriers? Both of these things together will provide you with a streamlined system, and then the risk optimization initiative gives you an added training and toolkit to target your audits effectively internally, so you can evaluate how your system is working and close gaps before they get troublesome or problematic. all of these things together will provide you with improved ROI, or return on investment, which is music to the ears of senior management, making them buy into the approach and making it more sustainable, as well as providing valuable input and feedback to investors and encouraging more investment in your business. So risk optimization gives you more clarity in your system, better understanding, and prepares you for the future in a more streamlined and effective way. Next slide, please. The fast track risk optimized cannabis safety system uses the Risk Optimization Resource Center's personnel's global experience in cannabis-focused safety systems training, implementation, and auditing. This is not just, you know, a transplant from food or transplant from animal food or pharmaceuticals. This is targeted to the problems that cannabis sector manufacturers and distributors face. As a result, the training that's associated with that is the expertise is focused on cannabis, as are the toolkits. So toolkits would include some things like risk assessment matrices, making sure that the actual risk assessment models from the cannabis sector are pre-designed, so you only have to modify them as necessary, and we show you how to modify them as necessary. So instead of building something from scratch, you've got a template that you're working on that's a typical cannabis focused sector, and then you can take that and adjust it much faster than starting from scratch. Similarly, a lot of the pitfalls have been researched. A lot of the supply chain hazards have been researched. So all of this is built into the training, the customized training, and the ready to use toolkits and templates for records that help you build a streamlined, integrated system that's ready for domestic and global markets. Finally, we also give you the tools to communicate the effectiveness of your system. Once you build a sustainable system, you want to be able to communicate that to customers as well as to regulatory agencies, such as domestic and foreign auditors or inspectors that are coming in to give you licenses or approve your products for export. We give you toolkits that enable you to summarize not only what you're doing, but the benefits of what you're doing over the standard approach, so that you can get more market entry and more market sustainability and expansion. And backing all this up is the technical support. We're going to drive it through Control Point, but it's the Risk Optimization Resource Center and all the professionals that work in it are available for your technical support. So we have things like e-guides, mini e-learning opportunities that reinforce training. So as you implement, you actually get more support for each topic as it arises. This helps you build a cost-efficient, integrated, and risk-optimized cannabis and hemp safety system. Next slide, please. So you're leveraging over 35 years of global training and system implementation, as well as audit experience, including proven cannabis sector expertise. We've built some of the largest cannabis safety programs in the world based on this approach. So
Victor, I think we lost a little bit of a connection for a second. Well, I'll use this opportunity just to remind everybody, use that reaction button to raise that hand for the Q&A session towards the tail end of our conversation. We're dedicating about 20 minutes for Q&A, and if we don't get to all the questions, we'll definitely be sure to revisit them because this is a series of sessions. Our next one will be on May 9th. But looks like Victor's back, so I'll pass it back to him.
Hello, everybody. I apologize for that. I just had a little technical glitch here. I'm going to take off my video just to make sure that doesn't happen again. So what we were talking about, and Trevor, let me know if you have any problems hearing me. But if what we were talking about was making sure that you use this experience to avoid pitfalls in your business. We offer consistent, proven virtual or in-person training, and that leads to a couple of levels of certification in training. A lead implementer certificate level 1 or level 2, where level 1 covers the basics of implementation and auditing of your system, and then level 2 gives you intensive workshops in actually implementing the toolkits. And these are, again, combined into what's called the risk optimization fast track initiative. And it has been proven in both distribution of cannabis and hemp, as well as in the manufacturing sectors. And it has been proven not only domestically, but also for export to countries such as Germany and Malta in the European Union. And next slide, please. So what is risk optimization? Risk optimization consists of some pillars that we focus in on. It starts with advanced hazard analysis, risk assessment, control tiers. Again, not just giving you clauses and giving you general terms, but also giving you the toolkits and templates that have already been developed from existing cannabis operations to help you kickstart your system. Together with that, we have a set of tools covering the supply chain for supplier safety, making sure that the supply chain is secure and can also withstand, or to a certain extent, withstand emergency situations, such as border closures. And we use a technique called a vendor monitoring scorecard that can be used internally as well as in supply chain to help you demonstrate or help you monitor suppliers on a risk-based methodology. We show you how to use advanced internal audit skills and audit analysis to effectively and time resource efficiently calculate or determine where your gaps are and close those gaps before they lead to problems and sustain your business moving forward. Advanced corrective action tools and tiered root cause analysis to help you, again, with templates, deal with any non-conformances or deficiencies that arise. And to put all this together, we have a toolkit for senior management to train them and show them how to interact with the system, not only to build the system effectively and provide resources, but also to make sure that your resources are used efficiently. So we provide targeted training and customized toolkits. I believe there's one attendee that cannot hear properly, Trevor. So any of you others having a similar problem?
Oh, I'm fine. Classy here.
Hi, Cressy. Okay, great. So Marjan, if you can reconnect, you should be able to hear. It's up. It's at your end. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. So what we have in a nutshell is integrated systems, rapid deployment toolkits, and expert training and assessments. These toolkits are learner focused. So we do things like we use multimedia training. We don't use huge manuals that nobody understands and nobody reads. Marjan, can you hear okay now? Okay. Well, hopefully she can hear better now. learner-focused training is extremely important, and it's a very underutilized tool. A lot of people train by using 20-page procedures that nobody will understand. So Trevor, if you want to send a note to Marjan saying we're recording the session, and she'll have it available later. So the learner-focused training allows uptake. Sort of, we use the YouTube concept more than complicated procedures. So we focus the training on the ones that are actually learning, and that allows better uptake. We provide expert gap assessment from the cannabis sector experience, knowing what the challenges are from export inspections, domestic inspections, licensing inspections. We know what the regulators are looking for. We know what they've been doing in the past, so we can prepare you better to prepare for them. We give you toolkits to build the efficient system, so you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from a standpoint of knowledge, whether you're consulting in the industry, whether you're training in the industry, whether you're doing certification auditing, or you're actually implementing these systems. These toolkits will help you integrate your system. So that's in a nutshell, what the risk optimization system does, and how it can lead you to global success and sustain your business more effectively and encourage more investment in your business. Now, to illustrate one of these things, one of these concepts more, one of the key concepts that that cannabis and hemp producers and distributors are facing is the challenge of elemental analysis, how to get your analysis done effectively and efficiently. So to dive deeper into one of these concepts and to show you how this initiative can be segmented, and to give you much more detailed information about topics upcoming in future webinars, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Robert Thomas, who's an expert in elemental analysis, and he will guide you through some of the challenges as well as some of the ways to overcome them. Robert, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Trevor. Appreciate the invite to contribute to this webinar. This is something that I've been involved with in the cannabis industry for the past 3 years, having worked in the field of heavy metal and trace element analysis for almost 50 years now. It shows my age. But today my talk is focused on regulating elemental contaminants in cannabis and hemp consumer products, and in particular how the cannabis industry can learn from the almost 20 years it took to regulate elemental impurities in pharmaceuticals. So let me dive right in by giving you an overview of my presentation. I'll kick off with the current status of heavy metal regulations for cannabis and hemp, particularly the limitations of a fractured state-based system. I'll then focus on how the pharmaceutical and dietary supplement industries approach regulating elemental impurities and how they abandoned the 100-year-old semi-quantitative colorimetric method for lead and replaced it with modern instrumental techniques. I'll also offer my perspective on what the cannabis and hemp industry can learn from this process, and give my thoughts on how the industry should move forward with federal oversight around the corner. So where is cannabis legal in the US today? Here's a map of the US with light green representing states where medicinal cannabis is legal, and dark green where both recreational and medicinal is legal. It is legal for both medicinal and recreational use in 37 states, with 18 of them allowing for medical use. Most of the 37 states have heavy metal limits. The majority of the states just specify the big four heavy metals: lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury. New York adds nickel, chromium, antimony, zinc, and copper, while Maryland and a few others add chromium to the big four. However, Michigan also includes inorganic arsenic and not total arsenic, as well as chromium, copper, and nickel. Oregon has no heavy metal limits at all at this current time. Let's take a more detailed look at some of the individual states to give you a better understanding of what I'm talking about. Here's a summary of 7 different US states: California, Colorado, Oregon, Maryland, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, picked at random, and compared United States Pharmacopoeia, Chapter 232, permitted daily exposure limits for elemental impurities in drug products, together with USP Chapter 2232, PDE limits for dietary supplements, and the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia limits for heavy metals in botanicals and herbal products. A couple of points to emphasize. USP Chapter 232 defines a total of 24 elemental impurities based on the drug delivery method, which is oral, parenteral, or inhalation, while Chapter 2232 only defines the big 4 heavy metals in dietary supplements. So in this table, 9 of those elements have been included to reflect the big 4 plus the additional elements regulated in New York, Maryland, and Michigan. It's also important to emphasize that Chapter 232 limits in this table are based on micrograms per day. So to know what's allowable in the actual drug or supplement, these limits must be recalculated based on the suggested daily dosage for the drug or supplement. For example, if the maximum dosage is 10 grams per day, these limits must be divided by 10 to convert to microgram per gram in the drug. So let's take a closer look at 3 of these states, which emphasizes the inconsistencies of these regulations. Let's begin with California. California was the very first state to regulate cannabis in 1996, and as a result, it is considered the gold standard with regard to cannabis regulations. California limits are defined in microgram per gram in 2 different categories: inhalation cannabis products and all other cannabis products. So these are the same as USP Chapter 232 PDE limits for inhaled and oral drugs respectively, based on 10 grams per day. However, it's worth pointing out that even though typical pharmaceutical PDs are based on 10-gram maximum dosage per day, we really have no way of knowing in what quantities people consume cannabis products. Another point to emphasize is that California requires a minimum of a ½ gram for carrying out the heavy metal determinations. Most other states do not have this stipulation, and lower weights are allowed. Here are the limits for Colorado, which are a little more complex to explain. Colorado limits are categorized by heavy metals of interest in the first column, acceptable limits in the second column, and products to be tested in the third column. The acceptable limits are defined in part per million in the product and not microgram per gram, as in California. Besides inhaled and oral, they also include limits for transdermal products via the skin. The limits for inhaled products are based on USP Chapter 232 limits for inhalation drugs, but the limits for oral products are based on USP Chapter 2232 for dietary supplements. However, the topical values are based on FDA limits for heavy metals in cosmetics. Here are the limits for Connecticut. They're defined a little differently because they're based on microgram of the heavy metal contaminant per kilogram of user body weight per day. So it's very difficult to get a good understanding what this means with regard to the maximum daily consumption, because it's only based on the body weight of the consumer. However, in toxicology studies, very often a typical body weight of 60 to 70 kilograms is used, but you still need to know what is the recommended consumption per day of cannabis product to make the calculation of the heavy metal maximum allowable limit. So let's talk more about the PDEs defined in USP Chapter 232. Here is the full list of USP Chapter 232 limits, which are based on maximum limits in microgram per gram for 24 elemental impurities in the drug compound per delivery method. So for a suggested maximum daily doses of 10 gram, these limits should be divided by 10. Also important to note that Chapter 232 limits are the same as the ones defined in ICH Q3D guidelines for elemental impurities. For those of you who are not familiar with the ICH, it is a consortium representing the global pharmaceutical industries, including the United States, European, and Japanese pharmacopoeias. A few additional points to make. These PDEs have all been determined using toxicology studies based on well-established animal models, which are fully explained in the ICH guidelines. They made recent changes to a few of the elements, which are shown here in red, based on updated toxicology data. Each elemental impurity is classified based on its likelihood of being found in the drug manufacturing process, which is shown in the second column. At this point, I think it's worth giving a little background to the United States Pharmacopoeia, USP. So the USP is an independent non-profit organization, which is not part of the US government. However, it works very closely with government agencies, ministries, and authorities around the world. The mission of the USP is to improve the health of people through public standards to ensure the quality, safety, and purity of medicines, dietary supplements, and foods. USP standards have ensured consistency of drug products throughout the world for close to 200 years and are recognized in more than 130 countries. These standards, known as USP-NF, is a book of public standards for drugs, substances, and products. And the FDA designates the USP-NF as the official compendium for drugs sold and marketed in the US, which must conform to these standards to avoid possible charges of adulteration and misbranding. So what is the USP process to change a standard or a specification? USP continually revises standards through a unique public-private collaborative process, which involves scientists in industry, academia, government, and other interested parties. The American Chemical Society was one of these interested parties that worked very closely with USP to update the test method for heavy metals. I lead the Heavy Metals Plasma Spectrochemistry Task Force on the ACS Reagent Chemicals Committee. The USP test for heavy metals described in USP Chapter 231 was first introduced in 1908 and is very similar to the test described in specifications and procedures for ACS reagent chemicals. When we updated our ACS heavy metals test, we wanted to make sure we aligned it with the USP test. The test relies on precipitation of the metal sulfide in a sample and compares the color intensity to a lead standard. USP felt that it was time to replace Chapter 231 with methodology that reflected modern test methods and updated toxicology data. So to put this in perspective, allow me to explain a little about USP Chapter 231 in greater detail. It is based on its sulfide precipitation of the analyte elements using an organosulfur compound and assumes that all analyte heavy metals behave in a similar manner to a lead standard, which samples are compared to. It is semi-quantitative at best that was initially intended to detect a small group of heavy metals, but there was no clear definition of which individual elements the test was detecting. It is well recognized to have many limitations, so it is pretty amazing that it survived over 100 years. So what are these limitations? This slide shows the colored sulfide precipitates of 12 different heavy metals. Imagine if all 12 elements are present in the sample, how difficult it would be to compare the color to the lead standard, which is circled in red. Some of these limitations include it cannot detect individual heavy metals. Typically 5 ppm is the limit of detection. It's very labor intensive, and the interpretation of the color often varies with the experience of the analyst, and it needs a large sample weight of approximately 5 grams to work correctly. So let's take a look at the USP timeline to change this method. It all began in 1995, where a USP Pharmacopoeia Forum report identified issues with the Chapter 231 method. And in 2000, an article in the Journal of Pharmaceutical and Biomedical Analysis proposed ICP-MS as an instrumental alternative. In 2004, A publication by Nancy Lewin and co-workers at Bristol Myers Squibb in the same journal showed major recovery issues with USP Chapter 231 compared to ICP-MS. However, it took approximately 14 years for various expert committees, expert panels, working groups, and stakeholder meetings to implement these proposed changes. In January 2018, USP Chapter 232 for elemental impurity PDE limits and Chapter 233 covering the analytical procedure were approved in line with ICH Q3D guidelines for measuring elemental impurities in drug compounds and substances. So how did USP and ICH propose the design and scope of these new PDE limits? They decided it was important to have a chapter specifically for pharmaceuticals only. They call this Chapter 232. They wanted to separate dietary supplements from pharmaceuticals. They call this Chapter 2232. They wanted to simplify the harmonization process between USP and ICH by separating the limits from the analytical procedure to measure them. They covered this in Chapter 233, which focuses on the use of ICP optical emission spectrometry, ICP mass spectrometry, and microwave digestion procedure, and a full list of validation protocols. So what elemental impurities could end up in the drug products? They identified 4 potential sources of contamination. Elements intentionally added in the formulation of the drug substance. Examples of these might include platinum group metal catalysts, which are often used in the organic synthesis of drug formulations. Elements that are not intentionally added that could be present in the preparation of the drug product. Examples of these might include talcum powder, which is used primarily for tablet compression. Talc is basically magnesium silicate, which is mined from the earth, so it could potentially contain high levels of certain heavy metals. Elements that are introduced in the drug substance from the manufacturing equipment itself. Examples of this include the leaching out of chromium, nickel, and iron from stainless steel mixing or storage vessels. And elements that have the potential to be leached into the drug product from the storage containers or closure systems. Examples of this might include traditional metals in some plastic and glass materials. The bottom line was that regulators required the pharmaceutical industry to have a comprehensive understanding of all elemental impurities in its drug products by categorizing them by their toxicity and the likelihood of them being found in the manufacturing process. Since 2018, all manufacturers of pharmaceuticals are liable to be inspected by the FDA at any time and be expected to show data that elemental impurities are below PDE limits. So let's talk more a little bit about the elemental classification, because it is important to understand these. This is a slide of PDEs defined in Chapter 232 in microgram per day for the 3 different drug delivery systems. But this time, I would like to emphasize the second column, which is the classification of the elemental impurity. So class 1 elements include the classic heavy metals, lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, which are human toxicants that have no use in the manufacture of pharmaceuticals. These should be evaluated at all times. Class 2A elements have a high probability of occurrence in the drug product and should also be evaluated at all times. Class 2B elements have a reduced probability of occurrence related to the low abundance, and as a result can be excluded unless they're intentionally added during the manufacture of the drug product. Class 3 are relatively low toxicities by the oral route of administration, but could definitely warrant consideration for inhalation and intravenous routes. So with this as background information, let's take a big picture look at the potential sources of elemental contaminants in cannabis consumer products. We can break these sources down into 3 main categories: cultivation and growing, extraction and processing, and packaging and delivery. So let's look at those three groups in a little more detail. So cultivation and growing sources. First point to emphasize is that cannabis and hemp are considered hyperaccumulators of contaminants in the soil and have been used for phytoremediation purposes to clean up heavy metals from toxic waste sites. So if plants are grown outdoors and there are high levels of heavy metals in the soil, they will likely end up in the plant. On the other hand, if the cannabis plant is cultivated indoors in greenhouses, where the growing conditions are far more stable and consistent, it is likely the levels of heavy metals will be much lower. Other cultivation-derived contamination sources include fertilizers, nutrients, pesticides, growth enhancers, and water systems. Second, processing and manufacturing sources. These include the extraction and purification process, including blending equipment, mixing containers, storage vessels, plus edible product recipe ingredients, and tablet or capsule formulations or oils used to dilute the extracts. And finally, packaging and delivery sources, such as metallic components in vaping pens and inhalers, low-quality plastic or glass bottles, and even inks used for graduated droppers, which are all notorious for having metallic contaminants associated with them. So what elements could potentially be of concern in growing cannabis and the manufacture of cannabis consumer products? So if the plants are grown outdoors, there are about 15 heavy metals found in natural ecosystems, and contamination from industrial activities such as mining, metal refineries, iron and steel plants, petroleum, petrochemical industry, fossil fuel power plants, etc., that could be potential sources of contaminants in the plant. Also, decades of using lead-based paint, water pipes, and gasoline have all left their mark on the environment. For example, it is well recognized that soil near major highways has much higher levels of lead beneath the surface from using leaded gasoline. Certain fertilizers, nutrients, and growth enhancers can have elevated levels of metals, including mercury, nickel, and silicon. The list of elements shown here are the ones taken from compelling evidence in the public domain of heavy metals being taken up at various levels by cannabis and hemp plants. There is also the potential for elemental contamination during the extraction and purification of the cannabinoids. There is no question that if the elemental contaminants find its way into the plant, into the flower, there's a good chance that it will end up to some degree in the cannabinoid extract. The degree of extraction will be impacted by the extraction method, the solvent used, and the temperature and pressure used for extraction. In addition, the manufacturing process could compound the problem based on metallic equipment such as stainless steel used to grind the cannabis plant, or mixing the cannabis extract, and diluent oils or colorant or cutting agent used, which could be contaminated, or just putting them into dirty glass dropper bottles or contaminated delivery systems such as vaping systems. There have been a number of product recalls over the past 6 to 12 months which emphasize this point. Let me give you a few examples. I have tracked 15 reports of product recalls over the past 12 months of elevated levels of heavy metals in consumer products. 5 of them are shown here, 2 in Florida, 1 each in Michigan, Maryland, and Hawaii. In fact, one of the cases in Florida showed that lead levels were approximately 30 times higher than the regulated action limit of 0.5 ppm for lead in Florida. There have been many more reports like this. So let me finish by summarizing my thoughts on future regulations for heavy metals in cannabis. The current list of 4 heavy metals, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, is clearly inadequate. However, the 24 elements required by the pharmaceutical industry might be an overkill. However, it is absolutely critical the cannabis industry has a much better understanding about the many potential sources of heavy metals in its products. I think that elemental contaminants derived from the cultivation and manufacturing process would warrant regulations at least an additional 10 elements in addition to the big 4. So a future federally regulated list of potential heavy metals in cannabis could include the big 4 plus additional 5 required by New York, Maryland, Michigan, plus an additional 6 elements based on compelling evidence in the public domain, making a total of about 15. I wrote a recent article in Analytical Cannabis which addressed this topic. This link is available on request. An indication the industry is slowly moving towards an extended panel of elemental contaminants is evidenced by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, developing a hemp certified reference material for 13 toxic elements. The list includes lead, cadmium, arsenic, mercury, beryllium, cobalt, vanadium, chromium, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, selenium, and uranium. NIST scientists argue that hemp is more in line with tobacco products and should be regulated in a similar manner. In addition, I sit on an ASTM subcommittee that is currently in the process of writing an ICP-MS method for measuring up to 21 elements in cannabis and hemp. Finally, USP has just published a draft monograph for CBD for use in FDA-approved drug formulations, which requires up to 24 elemental impurities to meet compliance. So at the end of the day, the only way the industry is going to know what elemental contaminants are worthy of consideration is to carry out a comprehensive risk assessment study similar to the pharmaceutical industry to identify where these sources are and at what levels. It is only then can we specify the panel of elements to monitor and their toxicity impact on cannabis and hemp consumer products. One final point I'd like to make is that not all testing labs that use ICP-MS are the same. So to meet most states' action limits for inhalation consumer products, for example, the lab will require to work very close to the instrumental limit of quantitation. Make sure the lab has experience in working in the ultra-trace environment, including microwave digestion methods, sample preparation, contamination control, and the optimum instrumental analytical method. Critically important areas include reduction of analyte background signal from sources of contamination, which are derived from sample digestion procedures, reagents, acids, and water purity, environmental fallout, and operator cleanliness, bad habits, and a general lack of experience in working at the ultra-trace level, which can all impact instrumental detection limits. This makes it imperative to have a comprehensive suite of validation protocols using certified reference materials and spike recovery procedures, such as those defined in USP Chapter 233 used by pharma testing labs. These are all important points to consider when choosing a testing lab for the measurement of heavy metals in cannabis and hemp consumer products, particularly those used for inhalation purposes. So with that, I'd like to finish with images of 3 of my books, which I have at the moment. They're all available from my publisher's website, or if you prefer to use Amazon, they're all available there as well. So I thank you for your time. Gladly welcome any questions, and I'd just like to hand back to Trevor for the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Excellent. Always a pleasure to be a part of these presentations. And I got about 11 questions for us to get started. But just as a reminder for the attendees, don't hesitate to use that digital hand wave, and we'll take more questions. And if you need to drop it in the chat, we can do what we can to go through there. But any additional questions will come back through, because as we share the video, when it gets shortened up for us, because we got about 5 minutes we need to take out from the beginning, then we can also follow up with the questions then. But just to put something into perspective, a lot of operations don't find this product safety to be too tantalizing. It's not sexy enough, as some of them like to refer, kind of like sailors buying insurance for their boat. They're like, I'm such a good sailor, I don't need this. But it's interesting because those droppers could be contaminating the product with lead. And Robert's the one that taught me that. So no longer do I use that CBD, but I can't because it doesn't really function with my anti-epileptic drug. But this question will be for you, Robert. What are concerns if investors don't see the value of product safety?
Well, yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer in a few minutes. But I think based on doing a lot of work with pharmaceutical manufacturers who were, when they first were told that they had to monitor up to 24 elemental impurities, I think it's fair to say the pharmaceutical manufacturers were initially kicking and screaming. That's a slight exaggeration, of course, but they were not happy with going from monitoring 1 heavy metal, lead, to monitoring up to 24. And it became a challenge to convince them that the manufacturing process for pharmaceutical materials had a number of contact points which could contaminate the final product. So we had to convince them that this wasn't an exercise that was purely theoretical. It was an exercise where they could get a much better understanding of the cleanliness of their pharmaceutical products and their pharmaceutical EPIs. So I remember working very closely with the United States Pharmacopoeia as the ACS Heavy Metals Task Force leader, just having to convince them that heavy metals are everywhere and you cannot ignore the problem. And at this present moment in time in the cannabis industry, monitoring for heavy metals is clearly inadequate. There is information out there in the public domain that there are many more elements that could potentially end up in your final consumer products. And the point you made, Trevor, with the dropper bottles, that was a fascinating exercise. They found out, and they did some studies, actual stability studies, that the ink that was used in the dropper was lead-based ink. And the ink initially, when the product was new, the lead was very low, but over weeks and months, that lead was leaching out of the graduated lines and leaching out into the CBD extract itself. And at the end of a 2-month stability study, they found out the level of lead in that extract was something like 30 part per million, where the regulated limit for lead was 0.5 ppm. So it is an area where the cannabis industry is just beginning to understand that the big four is clearly inadequate, and the momentum is definitely going towards expanding that elemental panel. I don't know how long it'll take, but the sooner they can learn from the pharmaceutical industry, the safer the industry will be.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And Victor, this one will go for you, but I think it's an emphasis of what we've just been moving through. How much of an impact does not addressing risk like elemental contamination have for an operation or even an industry itself, such as cannabis and hemp?
Well, first of all, the understanding where the risks are, as Robert mentioned before, you have to understand which elements you even need to focus in on. And then you have to understand how to get them analyzed properly, effectively, by a competent lab. One of the things that I was involved in was a major project with a buyer looking at evaluating submissions from different companies, different cannabis and hemp manufacturers. One of the challenges was because they didn't know they hadn't done a comprehensive risk assessment, didn't know how to analyze their elemental chemicals properly, they weren't allowed entry into this big buyer, this major buyer. And that's the challenge, is a lot of the testing requirements are built into the regulatory environment. So if you cannot get proper elemental analysis done, or you don't know which ones to get done, you're going to be in trouble in terms of market entry. And it could also be a factor in not seeing where these elements can arise in raw materials as well as in your finished products. And that could leave you exposed to recalls and litigation. So all of these do factor into your risk assessment. And that's why the risk optimization initiative sort of looks at the big picture, looks at how to implement, but then goes into these specific areas and gives you the expertise from these, through control point, gives you the expertise in figuring out where to do them properly and effectively.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And Robert, this one will go to you. How could operations partner with provinces or states? Like, what could they take to a state or province to say, we're looking to collaborate, do things together, rather than, we don't want you around us?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I'm not too sure that there's a simple answer. We can certainly, I think, put pressure on regulators that with standards organizations like NIST, ASTM, who are moving towards expanding the elemental panel. The momentum is going that way, and it's difficult to know when the FDA is going to get federal oversight of this industry. But the point I think we should emphasize is that you want to be proactive. And I point to the fact the United States Pharmacopoeia recently published a draft monograph for CBD, which was up for public comment, and I give lots and lots of comments to that published method. But it said that to comply with CBD that's used as an API in a federally regulated, a federally approved drug, maybe something like Epidiolex or something that's going through the approval process, it has to comply by meeting elemental impurities defined in USP Chapter 232. So that's telling me what the USP is getting geared up to do. So the majority of CBD that's produced in the States is regulated by different states, individual states where it's manufactured. So you can argue that if the states are only requesting the big four heavy metals, that CBD is not suitable to be used in a federally approved CBD product. So the momentum is going towards expanding that panel. We just need to go to the regulators to convince them you have to be proactive, because sometime down the road, if the FDA starts knocking on the door of state regulators and sees there's some deficiencies in the way the products are being regulated, and I'm not picking any state in particular, but we need a number of states to really, set the standard here and start increasing the panel. I take my hat off to New York State. They have 9 elemental contaminants. Michigan has 7, I believe. Maryland, Missouri has 5. So I think we just need to convince all states to slowly think about expanding the elemental panel, because it's going to happen at some point.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And what a perfect opportunity to take New York State and put this towards Victor and say, Victor, did you hear or see that there was pre-filed regulations that actually mentioned good manufacturing practices, 21 CFR 111 and 117?
Yeah, this is a classic example of how these elements have to be incorporated to be able to enter not only domestic markets but also international markets. One of the dangers, though, with just going from clause-based or going with one standard is you can end up with multiple systems. So, for instance, if you're domestically looking at 111 for GMPs, and then you're exporting to Canada, for instance, or you're exporting to the European Union, the regulations change or the guidance changes. So good manufacturing practices, even though it's kind of an all-encompassing term, can mean different things in different environments. So what we've done in the risk optimization approach is to merge these major requirements, and not only merge them as they exist today, but also keep you up to date on where these things are going, and then show you the techniques on how you can update yourselves on where these things are going. So it's not just a matter of meeting 111, it's a matter of incorporating 111 into a more encompassing system and running it efficiently so that the same system will feed the US market, the Canadian market, the EU market. So that's the efficiency of the system is important to identify, and that's what the tools that we offer and the training that we offer does. It's not focused on one market, it's focused on sustainability and adaptability as markets and regulations change.
Sounds like some of the best marketing material ever that you didn't need to pay a ton of money for. I love that. It's very empowering.
Yeah.
I think with that, though, I'll pass it. We'll actually wrap this up to be conscious of everybody's time. We did say that we were only going to dedicate an hour to this, but don't hold back. If questions rise, then please forward them along, and we will revisit them to share the material as well as the slides themselves. And then if it's something that you want to roll into the next session on May 9th, then let us know. But is there anything that you wanted to close out on, Robert?
Yeah, just like to emphasize that that the pharmaceutical, I can't emphasize this enough. The pharmaceutical industry took almost 20 years to get to grips with this. I mean, it was a painful process. I can assure you that, because I worked on a number of the the expert panels and expert meetings, and it was not easy to convince them that this was the way to go. And I came into the cannabis industry 3 years ago, having written a book on elemental impurities on pharmaceutical products. So my experience was based on the pharmaceutical industry, and then I came into the cannabis industry, and I was surprised, is a little bit of an understatement, but really staggered about the lack of understanding of the sources of heavy metal contaminants in the entire manufacturing process, from cultivation right through to the final way of delivering products to the consumer. And it took me 3 years to, I'm not saying that I've got all the answers, but I can tell you now that the industry is at a state where it needs to take this risk assessment extremely seriously, because it's gonna come round that federal regulators are going to take a serious look at the way the industry is regulating itself. And I can tell you now that I've learned a great deal from this industry, and I put it together in books and a number of publications, and I can pass those links on to you, Trevor. But I think it's important that we get an understanding of the industry, that we need to improve the way that we look at risk optimization, because it is not straightforward. And I have a series of articles coming up in Analytical Cannabis over the next couple of months, which looks at risk assessment in greater detail and makes some suggestions to the industry how best to move forward. So just want to make sure that I'm there if anyone has any questions about elemental contaminants and what I've learned over the past 3 years. Please feel free to read my publications, or absolutely email me with the questions also.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Robert. And Victor, any closing remarks for you?
Well, just to take advantage of some of the tools that risk optimization has to offer, because it will enhance not only cannabis implementation, but if somebody is involved in the certification process or looking at getting into that market, getting into the consulting end, even from a regulatory standpoint, developing and understanding the overall picture and how to build efficient, sustainable systems, so that, and also we give you a toolkit that will enable you to demonstrate what you're doing to others. So what this does is twofold. One, it builds an effective system. What the second part is, it avoids things being shoved down your throat. So if people understand you have a comprehensive system, you're less likely to get standards that don't correlate with what you're doing, or inspectors or regulators or auditors telling you, well, you have to do this and you have to do that, where they've already understood that you've done the risk assessment, you know what you're doing, and therefore they'll put less pressure on you to do their druthers or what they want you to do. They'll more be focused on the efficiency and effectiveness of your system, and they'll buy into it much more.
Absolutely. And for some of those resources for the rest of the attendees still here, if you go to controlpoint.consulting and you look at our webinars page, that's where we have a series of risk optimization courses and segments that gives you an idea in greater detail, and you get some visual reference of these tools that Victor has built for us. So highly suggest that you consider getting involved in one of those classes. And then that itself is it for today, but we'll see you on May 9th. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.